all here for a reason. We don't know the reason, but we're here for that reason. Maybe we're supposed to decipher that, but we're all here for a reason. This is not by accident. You know, our life was just a big surprise, but it was spectacular. Can you imagine what death is going to be like?
I've always rooted for Mike. I guess being from the inner city myself, there was something about watching a societal throwaway accomplish the unthinkable that resonated with me. And while his often unjustified aggression outside of the ring was unsettling, it paled in comparison to the inexplicable exhilaration I experienced watching this inconceivably explosive puncher make quick work of anything and everything in his pugilistic path. Of course, at some point the bad began to outweigh the good, and it all went terribly wrong.
Almost.
With all of the seemingly inescapable tribulation that surrounded him, many, including myself, began to ponder the very real possibility that this story would end tragically. But a lot of time has passed since then, and while Mike Tyson may understandably not be the first name that comes to mind when you think of a national treasure, I plan to display how this purely prodigious yet polarizing pugilistic pariah willingly and graciously climbed the ladder of social redemption, becoming a truly invaluable example of personal reformation. While it's hard to quantify the indelible marks that a child incurs when he or she is born and raised under poverty-stricken circumstances, what we know for certain is their life's trajectory as it pertains to interpersonal and monetary success will unquestionably be ill-affected. Minus the hands-on guidance and required resources essential to raising any child, youngsters in these particularly precarious predicaments sometimes opt for a less than fruitful escape. Mike Tyson, however, who was certainly headed in that direction, was fortunate enough to discover guidance and structure via his friend, boxing coach, life advisor, and eventually father figure, the legendary Cus D'Amato. From all accounts, it was evident from the very beginning that Mike was implausibly proficient at providing punishment. But it was more than that. Any knowledgeable observer could easily ascertain that this kid had all of the physical prerequisites to become an all-time great. And that he did. His rise to global stardom was something to behold as he quickly began disposing of his adversaries in an unprecedented and unfathomably ferocious fashion. This ostensibly physically deficient one-man wrecking crew was able to overcome his shortcomings in stature with his will, speed, precision, and punching power. And never mind his menacing demeanor, complete with an unmistakable 1,000-yard stare that made his apathetic feelings for your well-being painfully apparent. Before long, it appeared that opponents were conceding the loss previous to walking into the ring. Yet it wasn't long before Mike's insatiable desire for confrontation began to rear its head outside of the squared circle. Needless to say, public criticism was not far behind, and considering his less than storybook image and the history of America, one could surmise that some people were looking for any reason to disavow this physically imposing, rough around the edges inner city orphan who didn't fit their foolishly optimistic notion of what a forgotten child should be. Yet in the interest of fairness, by the time he was in the spotlight, Mike often came across as an incredibly unpredictable and unapologetically hostile individual whose solution for everything seemed to involve violence. A far cry from the plethora of polished pugilists, complete with million-dollar smiles that many in the US had become accustomed to. What I don't believe has been emphasized enough, however, is how much of Mike's rambunctious persona was a direct result of external programming as opposed to his naturally unassuming and timid disposition.
I always, even when I didn't have the belt, only thing that made me a champion now that I have the belt, I always thought I was the champion.
When he met Cuss, he finally found a person who displayed genuine interest in him. And with that came the ineludible fear of not wanting to disappoint and potentially relinquish this newfound affection. So when Cuss fed him a steady diet of war books and insisted the only path forward was to develop a viciously ruthless, take no prisoners mentality, Mike acquiesced. But it wasn't enough to believe in himself. According to Customato, it was incumbent upon Mike to embody intimidation as a vital psychological weapon to add to his arsenal and be brandished frequently.
Street kid, and I would come with like a tough kid. I never had an ego. I was never really jealous of anybody. I never really thought much of myself. But when I met Cuss and I started talking to Cuss, he made me believe that I was a god.
Unfortunately for Mike, any hyperbole in those lessons fell on deaf ears, as he seemed intent on developing adversarial relations with as many people as possible.
So you shouldn't talk anymore, unless you wanna. I won't talk nice to you and talk about fornicating with you and letting you suck my because if I was eloquent with you, you would still look at me as a scumbag.
His conflicts with the press allowed them to weaponize his increasingly negative image and paint him as the poster boy for society's inner city ills, which only served to divide a nation who was currently undergoing a new wave of racially tumultuous times. Ironically, it was now the public who had a tangible punching bag who they could verbally castigate, then point to and say, that right there is what we're afraid of. In some regards, Mike has never been able to completely shed that perception.
Have a problem? Turn off your station.
You know what? I think we'll end the discussion right now.
Then we could.
You got it. Have a nice fight, Mike.
Off.
I still remember watching the infamous and unspeakably cringeworthy Barbara Walters interview with his then wife Robin Gibbons, and that unshakable feeling at the core of my being that this could very well be the beginning of the end. And in some ways it was. To follow would be his first loss, and by a vicious knockout at that, something very few, if any, saw coming. It was official. One of my childhood heroes was not indestructible after all. And considering his extremely delicate and volatile nature, the only question became, would he now self-destruct entirely? A short time after, a young lady by the name of Desiree Washington would accuse Mike of rape, and about a year later, he was sentenced to prison for that crime. In 1995, Tyson was released from prison and initially picked up right where he left off, quickly disposing of Peter McNeely, Bruce Seldon, and Frank Bruno. But by 1997, he was disqualified in a rematch versus Evander Holyfield after biting off a piece of his ear due to frustration in the ring. An eerie moment, to say the least, pun intended, and an unfortunate culmination of what had been an extremely troubled existence. But Mike wasn't done. In 2000, in a fight versus Lou Savarese, he knocked down the referee in an effort to continue to strike his opponent after the fight had already been stopped. In 2002, he attacks Lennox Lewis's camp prior to the beginning of the fight, then proceeds to verbally assault someone in the crowd. The following year, he's divorced again, this time from wife Monica, and shortly thereafter claims to be bankrupt with nowhere to live and accepting money from unsavory characters. Finally, in 2006, he's arrested on suspicion of DUI and felony drug possession. While many exceedingly famous public personas will inevitably digress when the cameras are no longer anywhere to be found, in the years to come, Mike was somehow and miraculously able to circumvent this reality, returning to the public eye only in short doses, and to his credit, self-aware enough not to overstay his welcome. There was, however, a notable newfound sense of humility about him, almost as if he made a personal pact not to make a full return until he was as close to the best version of himself as he could possibly muster. Initially, he gifted us with cameo appearances in movies and a critically acclaimed one-man show, which I had the privilege of attending and found surprisingly entertaining. From there, it was off to the races, with his most recent success being his popular hot boxing podcast that debuted in 2018. Which brings me to my reason for making this short film. From the very beginning of my virtual acquaintance with Mike Tyson, I remember short glimpses during interviews where it was clear that beyond the pugnacious surface lied a remarkably insightful soul engaged in a perpetual tussle with a deeply entangled mind.
Simple, like you look at an eagle, he could be 300 feet in the air, and they can see a field mouse. And we can't see a field mouse if he's 10 feet away from us. So if he can see a field mouse from up there, our eyes are not properly programmed for us to see God. Maybe God is not meant for us to see.
And his hot boxing podcast, although awkward at times, allows you a more extensive glimpse into this magnificent mind.
Value of history is not necessarily scientific, but moral. By liberating our minds and, deepening our sympathies and fortifying our will.
Mike Tyson is quite simply an extraordinarily complex human being who will willingly walk you through the darkest chambers of his past with no concern as to what may be unveiled. He is self-reflective to a fault. If allowed, he will convert the answer to any question into a torturous self-analysis, not nearly as intent on wallowing in self-pity as it is on the subconscious release of unexercised doubt, agony, and fear.
Like she may watch me and may look up to me and think I'm a certain kind of guy, I'm a good guy, but they have to understand that I'm not worthy of praise. I mean, God is worthy of praise. It's true. And they do these things. I look at YouTube and I see guys have Mike Tyson, immortal, Mike Tyson, God, and I'm not worthy of that.
It's intriguing to witness as he often pauses before delivering a noteworthy and profoundly wise sentiment that only someone who is truly in tune with a righteous path could so easily articulate.
Any kind of killing is a form of self-hate. If I'm killing somebody, it's just everything I say about it. If I call him a dirty motherfucker, that's because I'm a dirty motherfucker. If he's a bitch-ass nigga, it's because I'm a bitch-ass nigga. We reflect of one another.
At times you feel guilty, knowing full well that you're using his pain to feed your intellectual curiosity. But then you remember that this is precisely his desire. You see, at some point during the past decade, Tyson transitioned from someone intent on providing pain to someone intent on providing healing. And it's been said many times that it's not how you start a journey, but how you finish that truly defines you. While my intent on making this film was not to glorify Mike Tyson's countless and sometimes unforgivable transgressions, nor did I want to speculate on any potential mental ailments that may have played a part in his behavior. I did, however, want to salute a man who went from fighting good fights to fighting the good fight. And for that, I say thank you, champ.
It's for you to have a happy ending.
I don't know about that. We're dealing with life on life terms.
What does that mean?
It's out of my control, truly. It's out of my control. I say, well, I'm responsible now. I have to be present for my family and my children. But when when that feeling comes, you have no control over it. I might want to die tomorrow, and that's just what it is. And that's how my mind works.